何をしている？
こぼれた恨み晴らさねば。
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Brereo Skarensky and welcome to the review of Valkyrie Drive Bhikkhuni. Valkyrie Drive is a multi-platform effort by Kenichiro Takaki, the same guy that brought us Serran Kagura. There's Mermaid, an anime series, Siren, a mobile game, and Bhikkhuni, this Vita game. Development has shifted from Tamsoft to Meteorize, the same studio behind Dekamori Serran Kagura, or Serran Kagura Bon Appetit in the West. The version I'm reviewing here is 1.01. I'm stating this because upon release, Valkyrie Drive featured a lot of bugs and balancing problems. With its 1.7 GB, patch 1.01 brought a completely revised menu interface, new splash screens with voiceovers, rebalanced difficulty modes, new requirements to unlock survival battles and challenges, corrected graphical bugs, and revamped the combat interface that now shows health on locked enemies, button hints, and made some standard attacks and all drives look flashier. The list is quite long, and there is the chance that future updates will bring even more changes, though I strongly doubt that they'll change how the game is played. Valkyrie Drive Bhikkhuni features a rather small cast, smaller than the first Serran Kagura, though nearly all shown characters are playable once you meet unlocking conditions, all linked to the story mode. The underlying story common among all Valkyrie Drive products is that girls might be infected with a virus that turns them into weapons when aroused. These girls are sent to different islands for some reason, I'm not really sure on why, and Bhikkhuni's specific storyline opens up with two sisters, Rinka and Ranka Kagurazaka, Mani Nagawa and Momo Kuzuryu reaching their assigned island. The story is brought forward by the usual cutscenes with characters talking to each other, and if you have gone through Serran Kagura games, you'll immediately recognize animation taken straight from them, just like some voices are. While the various voice actresses do a good job as usual, certain actresses like Yuko Bayashi use a delivery very similar to their old Serran Kagura characters. There isn't much character development to speak about, and everything is a big setup to have the girls fight. Unlike Shinobi Versus and Estival Versus, Bhikkhuni doesn't have individual storylines. Stages here are always faced with two characters, one that you'll directly control and a second that will provide support in form of drives. Drives are Bhikkhuni's transformations, and all characters can achieve up to 4 levels. The first drive level only gives some attack and defense bonuses, with subsequent levels granting one special attack each, along other stat bonuses. Drives and special attacks all use one special token to be activated, and tokens are collected by attacking enemies. Enemies come in waves and are pretty happy to stand around and get mauled by the chosen couple. As with the previous 3D Serran Kagura games, enemies seem to be there just to give you enough tokens to trigger drives and special attacks during boss battles, because their level of intelligence is very low, and more often than not you'll see enemies stand still, run around with no purpose, or trigger short-range attacks well away from you. Valkyrie Drive does try to establish enemy classes with the usual cannon fodder, long-range mages, healers and flyers, but does absolutely nothing to use them. There are large robots with a big weak point, but these enemies take damage from every strike, even if not aimed straight at their weak point. All enemy encounters degenerate in hammering the standard attack button with the rare jump to reach the few flyers that sometimes pop up, and the bigger enemies are defeated without you realizing that. Like in Serran Kagura Estival Versus, your character automatically turns to face the next locked-on target, so you don't even need to use the control stick for that. You might have noticed that I'm referencing Estival Versus a lot, and that's because Valkyrie Drive uses a tweaked version of that game's combat and graphics engine. The combat is less reliant on air combos and homing attacks, but it's otherwise the same, or even a worse version of that, because it's hard to point out differences between characters. The biggest difference is the reach of their weapons, and you'll favor those with a long reach like Momo and Rinka, because they can dispatch enemy waves quicker than others. Mana is the most original, and she's the only one that actually requires you to switch between attack buttons to use her bow or short swords. The downside is that bosses against Mana can do absolutely nothing due to her ranged attacks. In addition to character duels, there are large bosses with multiple weak points, but these fights are more boring than anything else, with bosses barely able to hit you with most of their attacks, and those attacks making minimal damage. They also highlight that the lock-on system, controlled via the D-pad and the right analog stick, is simply not meant to highlight specific targets. This goes along a camera completely unsuited to follow large-scale enemies. Valkyrie Drive has the same horrible camera as Estival Versus, though developers tried to mask its shortcomings with larger and simpler environments. The camera will still get stuck around corners, but at least not as much as in Estival Versus. The downside is that levels are expensive, and there is a lot of downtime between enemy waves where your character will have to wander around empty wastelands, where you'll notice that sometimes the camera wobbles up and down for some reason. Levels also have a certain number of hidden unlockables, ranging from clothes for the dressing room to secret missions. Valkyrie Drive encourages to explore levels, and also takes some time in setting up some platforming sessions to, well, I'd like to say to have fun with, if the jumping mechanics and camera didn't work together to create something horrible. Pressing X makes characters jump after a short delay. The delay is necessary because holding down X charges up for a dash useful to blaze through levels and on locked-on targets. However, when jumping is involved, the initial delay really kills it, and developers forgot to implement something as basic as characters and platform shadows to give you an idea where you'll land. The camera doesn't zoom out enough in these segments, and there is an overabundance of disappearing platforms with a way too fast timer, and you don't really know where you'll have to jump next until you rotate the camera, only that by that time the platform you're on would have faded away, forcing you to restart from the beginning. If you'll still care, because platforming in Valkyrie Drive is atrocious. Another way to get collectibles is by zooming between hovering points, which is done by simply charging up the air dash between them. These are way easier to pull off, almost automatic, but don't expect to understand where you are going, the camera simply can't keep up. Story mode can be faced in 3 different difficulty settings, with the only difference being how much punishment enemies can take. The bosses are a bit more aggressive in hard mode, but just like in Serran Kagura, these encounters can quickly be solved by spamming special attacks. If you don't have enough, don't worry. Bosses are more concerned in running around the battlefield rather than attacking you, and like enemy waves in these stages, you can get through them by just mashing the standard attack. That is, until the last 3 missions, where you actually need to learn some of Valkyrie Drive's advanced techniques. In these missions you start with no tokens for drives or special attacks, while bosses can enter the most powerful drive level from the start and spam special attacks. They don't flinch from your attacks, while you do. They can also one-shot you if you are particularly unlucky. Bosses don't follow any kind of pattern, so you never know when it's safe to attack. During these encounters, I discovered that dodging an attack at the last moment gives you some meter to build up drive tokens, and the only reliable way I've found to get through these encounters is to dodge until you have enough tokens for a drive and few special attacks. It's a very boring and frustrating process, because so far the game never asked this kind of technique. In fact, up till this point, Valkyrie Drive never asked anything beyond mashing a single attack button. Essentially, the game goes from boring due to excessive repetitiveness and lack of challenge to frustrating due to unfair conditions and requiring skills not mentioned once up till the final bosses. Sitting Serran Kagura again, think the fight against transformed Dogen in Serran Kagura Deep Crimson, only that there you knew how boss behaved. The combat never feels good, with some action having an apparently huge delay between input and execution, and this is also due to the uneven frame rate. Valkyrie Drive doesn't look particularly good, but also doesn't run good, unable to keep its target 30 FPS. It never gets unplayable, but it's also unable to keep those 30 FPS stable, even during boss fights. Add in huge loading times and you have a barely acceptable game to look at, and that's with a major patch applied. Straight from the box, Valkyrie Drive was even worse. Character proficiency in combat or drives is simply dictated by levels. At the end of a mission, experience points are divided between the two characters as you see fit, and I suggest to have support characters reach level 11 as soon as possible to unlock all drives and special attacks. Be advised that in a sad turn of bad interface design, you have to go through all level ups, something that gets downright painful when you are dealing with a new character, and new characters always start at level 1. In terms of fanservice, Valkyrie Drive is somehow tamer than Estival vs or Bon Appetit, which I find very strange. Keep in mind that we're talking about a game where girls have to get aroused to turn into weapons, and that special missions are unlocked by being groped by robots. Of course there is jiggling, but boobs here are two huge spheres attached to a character, rather than something belonging to the character herself. Boobs bounce up and down, but they look incredibly fake. In addition to story mode, there are challenge and survival mode. The scope of these modes is self-explanatory, and while they do add some value to the game, they aren't particularly enticing to play. Challenges start with repeating a certain attack 3 or more times, and survival mode is about taking on waves of enemies until they run out or you're defeated. Unfortunately for these modes, the combat system is not technical or fun enough to warrant these tasks, and I've stopped playing Valkyrie Drive after being done with the story. Once again, Marvelous went for fan service rather than a good game. Valkyrie Drive is a reskin of Serran Kagura Estival Versus that only makes token attempts to correct its spiritual predecessor flaws and add others on its own. And every flaw there is simply shouldn't be here because developers had plenty of games to refine the formula. Valkyrie Drive fails in being a technical action game or a button masher. Its ideas might be in the right place, but their execution is extremely flawed. Will future patches correct these flaws? I don't think so, unless Marvelous and Meteorize completely rethink the combat system. The scarier thought is that these flaws will go unaddressed in future installments of the series, if there will be, judging how Marvelous is managing Serran Kagura. I hope you have enjoyed this review and you'll stick around for more. Briareos Kerensky, over and out.